Okay, perfect. And just a note then, if you don't want to be recorded, just turn your camera off as well, and just have your name or just first name if you prefer. So we'll just get started. First, I just wanted to introduce first RE-PEAT, and then we'll go around and just do a short introduction each. So some of you may know already, we're RE-PEAT, and we're a youth-led group that is working on creating more conversations around peatlands. And we try and do so through very collaborative and educational means, and very creative means as well. And today we just wanted to talk a little bit about peatlands and the role they play in nationally determined contributions as part of the mock COP26 and all the talks that are going on as part of that. And I'm just going to pass around to each person to introduce themselves, and I'll just go first myself. So I'm Bethany. I'm living in Amsterdam at the moment. I'm from New Zealand, and recently finished studying my bachelor in environmental science and policy, and I've been involved with RE-PEAT for about a year now. And then I'll just go to you, Frankie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. My name's Frankie and I'm also living in Amsterdam. I studied illustration, but also in a very interdisciplinary degree where I got film history and environmental science. So that was a very weird degree that kind of all tying into this kind of stuff that we do with RE-PEAT. And I'm going to pass to Carolina.
Hello everyone, my name is Carolina. I am from Italy, but I was studying in Amsterdam, and that's how I got involved in RE-PEAT as well. And yeah, right now I'm back in Milan, and I'm excited about this presentation. Maybe Lainey can go.
Yeah, hi guys, my name is Lainey. I'm originally from the United States, but I'm also living in Amsterdam, and I just finished an interdisciplinary degree in computer science as well as environmental sciences, and I'm currently working in Amsterdam. And yeah, I'm really excited to host this presentation.
Nice. Is that all for the introductions, Beth?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I think we're going to do a quick poll just to get everyone involved and see what your peatland knowledge is. So in a moment you should see a poll coming up and you can all get the chance to answer some questions.
You think that's time enough? Shall I stop it, or should we give you we'll give you a 10-second warning to answer any of the other questions if you still want to go?
Yeah, there's 8 of 13 that have answered so far. So.
Ah, okay.
We got 9 now.
Oh, I mean, I also didn't do it myself, so maybe that's also part of it.
Ah, yeah. Okay, I think it's 10 out of 13. I don't know if that's us as well included.
I think maybe we can just, should I end it now? Then you can give people the
Yeah.
answers anyway.
Okay. Can everyone see the answers? Maybe put a thumbs up if you can see the answers. Okay, nice. So in fact, only one person got the second question right, which is, I put it there because it's particularly shocking. Yeah, so the EU only needs to re-wet 3% of its agricultural land to save 25% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So
Wow.
this was, yeah, it's pretty astonishing. This was a fact that I got from a policy paper that Wetlands International, the Greifswald Center, and the University of, where was it? An Irish.
The National University of Ireland,
National
Galway.
University of Ireland. They published a policy paper about the CAP, and this was a fact that I found from there. And indeed, this year will be the year that countries will be requested to submit their NDC. So this year is actually a very turning point year, or like a very important year for NDCs. Okay, cool. Well, that was a nice little way of sharing some more information before I go on to the rest. And the first thing I'm going to go over is just a PEAT 101 for those who don't know about peatlands. I think we can exit the poll. In fact, I'm now going to open up the presentation and share screen. Okay. And now let me see. Okay. Is this working? It's not on the right slide. We might have come into a technical moment.
There should be an option on the top right hand side, Frankie, I think, to start presenting.
This button,
yeah, for me it says present, but for you I guess it says join.
Yeah, maybe you can share your screen instead of me. Is that possible?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Okay, is this gonna work? Oh yeah, okay. So it's working now.
Wait, Frankie, I don't know if these are the right slides because that's the wrong colors.
No? Oh, okay.
I think it might be a previous version.
Ooh.
Maybe Bethany can share?
Okay. Then
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop sharing. Sorry.
Maybe you can just already get started with what you were going to say, and you'll have to very descriptively tell it until we get the visuals.
All right. Yeah,
and
that's
then
good.
I'll share in a second.
So PEAT 101. So peatlands are formed when you have a depression in the land, and in the land you get some kind of water forming, and the plant matter that is around the water falls into the water and changes the properties of the water to make it less, to lower the oxygen level and to increase the acidity. And what this does is basically over periods of thousands of years, the plant matter gradually builds up. So you get this layering and layering of partially decomposed plant matter. This is what you call peat. And as long as peatlands are healthy, they are forming, so they can, as they kind of fill up this depression in the land, they become a fen. And then as they carry on building, then they can become a bog. And that's basically in a chestnut. And something that's really interesting about peatlands is that there's this really kind of interesting thing where you have, like, on the one hand, healthy peatlands have this kind of positive cycle or positive kind of wheel, you could say, of all these different things that they offer, or all these different like gifts. So they are very good with flood protection, they're very good with biodiversity, have very unique habitat, they protect against saltwater intrusion. They have a number of different benefits, and one of them is that they, of course, store a lot of carbon, because they are made out of partially decomposed plant matter. The carbon stored in the plants doesn't get re-emitted as CO2. So this is like the kind of positive side of peatlands, and when you drain them, unfortunately, a lot of these things get reversed. So where they were once really good at flood protection, they now maybe cause flood hazards, or where they were once very good at water purification, they might then start polluting water. And the same thing with CO2. So again, all of the CO2 that is stored in peatlands, as we saw before, they're 10 times the efficiency as forests in terms of CO2 storage. And when the water is drained, the plants reoxidize and the CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. And currently, as you also saw in the poll, peatlands are almost 3 times the aviation industry if you look at the CO2 global emissions. So it's really like this interesting thing when you compare, like, the wheel of life, wheel of death, kind of, how, that's what I call it anyway. And one of the reasons why peatlands are drained is for agriculture. So this is a big reason, but sometimes, for example, in Ireland, they're drained for, they were traditionally used as fuel, but there can be many reasons. But one of the reasons why, the kind of overarching themes that we found, is that peatlands in their natural form are often seen as wastelands. They're seen as kind of, they need to be drained in order to make them useful. So they need to be drained in order to produce whatever agricultural product or whatever. And this is definitely the biggest, this is what we see as the biggest barrier, is this kind of attitude or perception of peatlands as wet peatlands as wastelands. So I think we can go on to the next slide. And in fact, maybe we're already going on to, so this is the paradigm shift that we want to create, is that healthy wet peatlands are not wastelands, but they're actually very valuable for a number of different reasons. And I think we can move on to Carolina's.
Okay, so now I wanted to talk to you about the difference between geoengineering and nature-based solutions. So let's start with geoengineering. Geoengineering, or also known as climate engineering, is an umbrella term that is kind of encompassing all the humans' interventions designed to change the Earth's climate system. So these can be used like technologies that tackle the causes and the impacts of global warming. There are 2 main approaches. There are carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management. So carbon dioxide removal is basically removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And such techniques can be, for example, carbon sequestration technologies, which are taking the CO2 that is emitted and liquefying them and burying it under the earth, so like down below. And another technique, another technology is like ocean fertilization, which is spreading like these like powder or of iron into the oceans, and then kind of that would supposedly absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere and putting into the ocean. And then other like the solar radiation management technologies are instead technologies that are not necessarily trying to remove the greenhouse gases, but they're instead trying to compensate the effects that these gases have on our Earth. So by deflecting the sunlight from the Earth. So basically, some technologies are using satellites or shields with movable deflectors to kind of deflect the sunlight from the Earth away. So of course, we can see that these technologies can have a lot of problems. They're definitely quick fixes, and they have quite a narrow approach. So it's not quite like holistic, but really focus on like, okay, now we're emitting this CO2, and now we're going to try to like find like a quick solution to this. And they're very reliant on technology. There are high risks of unintended consequences. They can't really be implemented unless like really like being tested, unless they're tested on like a big scale, which means already being implementing these and could potentially causing a lot of harm if things like are not really going as planned. But so now let's move to nature-based solutions to look at other opposite or almost opposite solutions. So nature-based solutions instead are solutions that are inspired by and supported by nature. They focus a lot on bringing biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. Some examples are bringing nature into cities, so biodiversity into cities. Other examples are restoring and protecting forests and wetlands and peatlands. These have the effects of securing and regulating supplies, water supplies, protecting from soil erosion, floods, landslides, as well as like mitigating climate change because of carbon sequestration, because they're a powerful source of like absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, away from the atmosphere. Sorry. Then also other solutions are protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems like mangroves, reefs, and salt marshes. And these also function as carbon sequestration, as well as adaptations, climate change adaptation through protection from erosion and storm surges. So all of these solutions are definitely have more of a holistic approach and like an approach on benefiting ecosystems as a whole. There are also benefit to humans as part of the ecosystems, in a sense that, for example, the projects in the cities, for example, can also have impacts on local communities. So bringing also more like harmony in the natural environment. There one type of nature-based solutions, which are ecosystem-based adaptation, is very interesting because it has this conception of trying to rethink how society and nature can work together. So rather than focusing on how society and nature will benefit from like adaptation measures, it really tries to find this balance and how the two can go together. And so also impacting, providing a series of ecosystem services to reduce vulnerability and to build like this like ecological resilience, which is extremely important. Maybe you can change slides. However, of course, like if they're not being implemented in the right way, they can also bring to like certain negative outcomes. And most of the time, the negative impacts of these potentially very good and useful solutions is that they're being implemented in a system that is still it's still like a system of exploitation. It's still a system of like burning fossil fuels. It's still a system in which you know, like the powerfuls are still predominant. So for example, there can be ways of implementing them in a wrong way when there's not enough awareness about local environments and how, you know, which kind of nature-based solutions can work in a certain ecosystem, in a certain place, with a certain like social groups. You can't just, you know, plant forests like monocultures, of trees, and in a place where they're not like native from the area, and then expecting that, you know, that will like create like a positive impact. And another problem is connected to social justice issues and human rights, because some conservation programs, that's still the same slide, some conservation programs are forced like there have been conservation programs in the world where they impose this conservation without taking into account the indigenous and local people. So they end up like dispossessing and causing violence to these people, because they're like targeted as like damaging the forest or the area, because instead of, you know, being the protectors or being like the people that have been living for years in synchrony with this. And another important part of it, which is also quite related to, you know, how policymakers or governments or, you know, big corporations are also kind of using and instrumentalizing these solutions to still kind of maintain the status quo. Because, for example, some nature-based solutions or some projects can be turned into carbon credits. So you, for instance, if you have, you know, a certain amount of like trees that absorb a certain amount of CO2, you can calculate that how much CO2 like the forest will be absorbing and turn them into a carbon credit, which then like what happens is that these carbon credits are being traded in the market. And so like, you know, fossil fuels industries can buy these credits. So when they actually have to report how much CO2 emissions they emit, they just, you know, just say, okay, we are not emitting this, but they subtract the carbon credits that they bought from projects somewhere else. And then so when they report how much they're polluting, they're actually polluting more, but they're not the reported emissions are lower. So you can easily see how this can cause consequences, in a sense, that negative consequences, because then, you know, the polluters still pollute and then instrumentalize these in the wrong way. So yeah, this is also good to keep in mind. But of course, if they're being implemented in a good way, they have a lot of beneficial benefits. And so it's important to take into account not just the ecological dimension, but also the social dimension. And to also support like local communities when doing that. So now we're going to talk about nationally determined contributions, and Lainey's going to present.
Yeah, hi guys. So I'm going to be talking to you about NDCs, which stands for Nationally Determined Contributions. And the concept of a nationally determined contribution emerged out of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Where countries were asked to provide what their plans were for climate action after 2020. The reason that they decided to use nationally determined contributions, it allows each country to provide climate action on their own terms, taking into account their own capabilities, particularly their economic circumstances or the circumstances of their natural resources, to be considered in the creation of their target climate goals. So that's what a nationally determined contribution is. You can go to the next slide, Bethany. So the current targets that were put in place by the Paris Agreement that are meant to be addressed by the nationally determined contributions is that we need to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, and we are strongly urged to keep it less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also want to have countries' emissions peak as soon as possible and also have them decline. And there also needs to be transparency about countries' climate action and lack thereof. So those are the targets that are currently being addressed by the NDCs. And every 5 years, so this year actually, they need to update their NDCs. Each individual country needs to update and publicly publish their NDCs. So all of the NDCs for the different member nations, so 190 countries have NDCs. needed to be updated by the end of this year. So one example from the Netherlands, which is the country where I'm living now, is that their greenhouse gas emission target for 2030 should be 40% below 1990 levels. So that's this year's updated NDC from the Netherlands, which has pretty high goals, mostly because it was a very highly polluting country. We can go to the next slide. So where nature-based solutions come into this is nature-based solutions are a really big opportunity for countries to achieve their NDCs and also conserve nature at the same time. So greenhouse gas reductions in the industrial sector, so in the business sector alone, are not going to be enough to reach that 1.5 degree benchmark. We need to also monitor our and reduce our emissions in the agricultural and nature sector. So nature-based solutions could provide about 30% of the mitigation that we need by 2030 to achieve those targets that we are talking about with the NDCs, remaining below that really crucial 2 degrees Celsius point. And currently about 2/3, about 65% of the current NDCs include nature-based solutions, but they're really lacking really concrete action plans that say, this is exactly the target that we want to reach with our nature-based solutions. Oftentimes they're really vague, which is not really adequate given that we're kind of coming down to the wire here with the Paris Agreement and reaching those targets. Furthermore, a lot of the nature-based solution requests that were currently submitted to the NDC partnership are pretty strongly focused on adaptation efforts, so adaptation to climate change and how we're going to adjust to global warming, versus mitigation, which is how we keep that warming from happening in the first place. So only about 12% of those nature-based solutions are focused on mitigation efforts. And it's a lot easier to mitigate than it is to allow that warming to happen, have unknown consequences occur, and then mitigate according to those. So it's a really big opportunity for nature-based solutions to kind of adjust to become more mitigation focused. I think you can go to the next slide, Beth. So how do peatlands fit into nature-based solutions and the NDCs? Well, as we already talked about, peatlands are a massive source of carbon, and when they're drained, a massive source of carbon dioxide. So we're actually potentially able to save about 5% of all global emissions just by re-wetting peatlands. So that's a pretty tremendous benchmark and a pretty tremendous opportunity right there. So nature-based solutions could fit pretty easily into peatlands through conservation of existing wetlands, re-wetting of drained peatlands, and restoration of degraded mangroves to reduce emissions. And this really goes beyond only being a useful option or a nice option to have, in that the land area of our planet can only become a global net carbon sink by 2100 if about 60% of today's degraded peatlands would be re-wet. So not only is this a great opportunity to include in the nature-based solutions, but in reality, it's something that really needs to happen because peatlands are just such a massive carbon source when they are drained and degraded. So here, the world really has a big opportunity to not only restore these really beautiful, magical places, but also to, protect our global climate. So we at RE-PEAT think that it's, really important that we ultimately fit peatlands into the NDCs by including nature-based solutions to restore our peatlands. And finally, it's just very important to do this in a quantifiable way and really have those kind of robust concrete targets that I talked about that are kind of lacking right now with nature-based solutions in the NDCs today. You can go on, Beth.
Okay, great. So taking all of that into account that the others have spoken about, one of the questions that RE-PEAT has really been grappling with, and lots of other groups as well who work with peatlands and with wetlands, is how we can make peatlands a larger part of this conversation, because yeah, they have this enormous potential, but so frequently it is that they seem not really part of the agenda, or at least not as much as they deserve to be part of the agenda. So it's something that we've been really thinking about, how we can bring these up on the agenda a bit more. And so I just wanted to talk about some of the ways that we've been reflecting on the best practice to do so. And so one of these was, as you can see there, the first one, interdisciplinarity. And I think for us, this was because when we first learned about peatlands, it was something that we felt like we hadn't known enough about, considering that many of us had studied environmental science or environmental policy, or had been involved in climate groups of some kind. And it was really a gap in our knowledge, it felt like. And then coming to that realization, we decided, well, probably lots of other people are in the same situation. So we had this, and then we also had this element of coming from a lot of different perspectives and being very excited about the idea that peatlands seem to us this very liminal place. So this place of betweenness or intermediariness, where they're, for example, not quite land, not quite water, and they're not quite dead, they're not quite alive. And often you find in literature and in myths that they're places of transition between the underworld and our world, or between the civilized and the uncivilized world. And so they really embody this sense of liminality, which is really exciting, because then for us, it allows us to bring in this kind of climate and ecological science and research aspect alongside the literature and the myths and other disciplines such as art, really into these conversations, so we can create more well-rounded conversations that appeal to a broader base of people as well. Because we all have our separate interests, of course, then if we can bring peatlands into many of those different conversations, then naturally you have more people talking and being interested in appreciating peatlands. So that really for us was very important. And we really think it's been very effective and also very enlightening for us as well. So that's really great. And the other one that you see there is then enthusiasm. So as I was saying, we found that when we were learning about peatlands, it really was reflected in our surroundings as well. As I started talking about it with my family or friends, it also seemed that they didn't know very much about it either. And so by bringing it up in lots of different kinds of conversations, it really, it brings about much more appreciation and understanding. And I think it's really reflected also in the way that RE-PEAT has grown as a group, because it began with a few of us talking very enthusiastically to our friends about it, and then people getting more and more involved, a bit like a snowball, I suppose. So I think that has been really great. And touching back onto this interdisciplinarity aspect is the fact that peatlands, as the others have also touched upon before, fit into so many different conversations. So you can talk about it when you talk about climate and ecology and how we fight those crises, but you can also talk about it when you're talking about land subsidence, for example, or water purification, or how we grow mushrooms, which currently right now are also grown on peat substrate. So there's a lot of different conversations that can be had that can bring in separate interests. And we found a way, I think, to do that in a very enthusiastic way, which I think also always helps. And the third thing that I wrote down there was youth. And I think this is very interesting because, of course, as youth, we're facing a future that is very undecided and is quite, potentially very dangerous and very scary. And I think that gives youth this very strong and stirring voice as well. And what's interesting, I think, with peatlands is that you can kind of, and including youth in these conversations, is that you can have equally a young voice, but also deep time, because peatlands take thousands of years to develop. They can take a shorter time, but of course they can take thousands of years to develop in their fullness, which is then talking about deep time, so thousands of years. And I think it's really powerful when you have youth who are looking to their future and also understanding or attempting to understand deep time and what that means. Because in order to do that, you have to think outside of yourself and your lifespan. And so I think that's really powerful as well. So those were 3 things that we've decided and been reflecting on as ways to try and create this larger conversation around peatlands, and to allow more people to realize that it is a very potentially powerful tool that we can use in the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. And actually, I think if any of you have any ideas as well, you're welcome to put them in the chat. Or maybe at the end, if we have some questions, you can say them then, because of course, it's always good to reflect on more ways we can try and create peatlands to be a larger part of the conversation. So please feel free to add any ideas that you have in the chat or afterwards. And otherwise, I believe that I'm passing on, Frankie, you can maybe correct me otherwise, but I think I'm passing on to Elise to talk a little bit about what Youth Engaged in Wetlands have been doing.
Yep, that's right. Elise, are you here?
Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll just very quickly, 2 minutes, give you a bit of an update on Youth Engaged in Wetlands. And thank you very much, RE-PEAT, for this opportunity. This presentation has been fascinating and also super insightful into the NDC process. And I absolutely love how RE-PEAT is tackling this paradigm shift. And it's wonderful to be able to work with you guys on so many different aspects related to peatlands and wetlands. Just briefly to talk about an event that happened a few weeks ago with Wetlands International. We worked together to create a youth dialogue on wetlands and climate action around specifically the NDCs and the updating process, to make sure that we can to find a way that young people can also help the advocates that are looking to integrate peatlands and wetlands into the NDCs. And with that in mind, one of the key actions that came out of this dialogue is to prepare a sort of an open letter in support of these advocates on behalf of youth, to put forward this critical need of including wetlands in NDCs and having them better recognized at this international level within the Paris Agreement processes. So right now, the idea is that we're going to meet for the first time with those that are interested in drafting this open letter on the 10th of December. And then together with this group, we'll establish a little bit more the exact purpose, the exact target, and by when we want to finish this open letter and then send it out, basically. And so if anybody's interested in working on this with us, with RE-PEAT, with Wetlands International, it would be featured as part of the Power of Wetlands campaign, which has been going on also and has had quite a lot of attention, and to contribute to producing an advocacy action towards integrating wetlands and peatlands within the NDC process. If you have any questions, you can also write to me. I'll write my address there in the chat box. But yeah, and thanks RE-PEAT again for this wonderful opportunity.
Of course, thank you for presenting, and also thank you for this letter writing campaign. We're definitely going to be part of it. And happily, we're quite sparse speakers, so we've now got like 20 minutes or so for questions and inviting everyone into the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's the easiest if you type your question into the chat, so we're not talking over each other.
I just want to point out, Elise has a really nice background photo there. Just everyone wants to have a look at this little photo that's for the, oh, now it's gone. But it said "For the love of Pete" with the sign. It was really nice, Elise. There we go. No, of course you can have your camera on, but everyone can take a quick look first, maybe. Not that you should turn your camera off. I also saw Wendy just shared a link. I hadn't actually heard of them, so it's really nice that you share that, Wendy, because I'll have a look afterwards. That's really nice.
maybe, oh,
I wanted to maybe add something that maybe we didn't quite speak about enough before. There is a question, but maybe I'll just say it anyway. We talked a lot about the role of peatlands in climate targets, but also something which is to bear in mind is that peatlands form over thousands of years. They form very slowly. And so really we're looking at stopping the CO2 rather than maybe taking the CO2 out in this very fast way. So I think that's maybe something to also understand as well, that re-wetting is not necessarily going to take the CO2 straight away, but it has, if you compare, for example, the CO2 coming out of the atmosphere from peatlands, they just take. Whereas you have a tree that maybe builds over a period of 100 years or a couple hundred years and then biodegrades again. So it's fluctuating in a much faster period of time. And this is also something that we've taken a little while to get our head around as well, is like all these different time periods and the way that these different emissions work as well. So for example, CO2 is in the atmosphere less than methane, longer than methane, but methane is more potent. So you have to kind of always balance up all these things. It becomes kind of complicated. And there is a question. There's now a few questions, so that's nice. Is there an estimate of the amount of wasteland across the world, and where is it most prevalent? Wasteland meaning
Peatland?
drained peatlands? Could you maybe clarify what you mean by wastelands, Wendy?
Yes, drained areas.
Drained areas.
So, I mean, we know some figures from the EU at least. So it's about 15% at the moment that has been drained in the EU. But of course, that it's tough because there are different levels of degradation and drainedness, I suppose. So it's kind of tough to make a really full estimate, which is made even more complicated by the fact that until recently there have not been a lot of wide-scale research and study into where peatlands are located, their depth, their extent across different countries. And it's only in the past few years that there's been much more national collaboration to create like one set of data, basically. And until then, it was kind of a bit higgledy-piggledy to say. And but about 15% in Europe at least, and then otherwise in the world it's slightly different. But in almost everywhere where they exist, they have been drained and degraded to some extent.
I also,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, I also see a question from Rosalind asking if peat is still being used as fuel. And I know in Europe, it's not really anymore. I think in Ireland, they still are burning peat for fuel, and it is quite a big source of emissions there. But nowadays in Europe, the primary reasons for degrading peatlands is to harvest peat for horticultural purposes. So to use it in potting soil. So most potting soil that you would purchase at a garden shop has peat in it. And the other reasons why it is being degraded in Europe, at least, is to create agricultural land. So in the Netherlands, for example, a lot of peat has been drained to create grazing land for dairy cattle. And I know that in other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, there are also peatlands. They look different than the peatlands we have in Europe, but they also have peatlands there. And often in those regions, they are being drained for palm oil plantations, paper plantations. So I would say nowadays you are generally seeing peat not used so much as fuel, but rather peatlands being degraded to create more agricultural land space and to use the peat soil for horticultural purposes.
I did also come across somewhere, there are two countries I think that are still burning a little bit more as well. One I think is Finland. I can't tell you exactly, so maybe don't quote me fully on it. But they still, it's kind of indeterminate a little bit, like they're not, I think it's not fully transparent how much is still being used there for that. And recently I also came across an article of a peat power plant that's being built in Rwanda at the moment. They're not yet burning the peat, as far as I understand, but it is like in the works. So I guess there are still some places that are, but yeah, as Lainey said, I think primarily, like in Europe, predominantly not anymore. Does somebody want to take charge of reading the questions? I don't know.
Yeah, I can read the next question. The next question is from Aisley. Hey, I'm from Ireland, and it seems our government just wants to plant non-native Sitka spruce monocultures as a means of sequestering carbon. Do any of you have suggestions on how we might encourage planting in places that are not peatlands? Many of these plantations are on peatlands at the moment, and they result in a number of different problems.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you go, Frankie. Yeah.
I wanted to mention that story that we read, and I think it was by Robert Macfarlane, but it could have been somebody else. If I'm remembering it correctly, it was Robert Macfarlane, and it was basically the story of a community in Scotland, pretty sure, where they were going to build a wind farm on a peatland, and the story goes that the wind farm company tried as hard as it could to make the case that this was a wasteland, this was a nothing space, this was like the best place to plant a wind farm, to build a wind farm, because there was nothing, it was just nothing, no man's land. And what the community did was they came together and they gathered all of the old Celtic words for peatlands, or for different like place-based meanings of the peat, and they created like a book of all the different terms, and through demonstrating the fact that this space was filled with meaning, was filled with this language, they managed to stop this wind farm being built. So I thought this really just stuck in my mind as this really powerful action of like just demonstrating, like going full in with this demonstration of like, this is about this has meaning, you know. This is something that, yeah. Beth, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to speak a little bit about how, yeah, somehow I think forests, and of course, like in a way you can understand it because they are places that maybe you experience differently than peatlands, in that maybe when you're in a forest, it's a different feeling essentially, I suppose. And I think then forests took on this very, yeah, also deserved, but this place as being a tool against the climate and ecological crisis, that if we just plant 1 billion trees, then at least some of the problems have been gone away or something. But I think, yeah, when we're talking about nationally determined contributions, I think it would be really valuable for countries to look into what their contribution can be. So it's not that every country, I think, should suddenly start building. Both of us have an issue with like wind farm. I'm building trees and you're planting wind farms. That we should plant all these trees. I think some countries like Ireland should reflect a little bit maybe on the extent of peatlands they have. The problem then is that I think we have to have a society that appreciates deep time again a lot more, because of Ireland, then they would see less of an instant impact if they were focusing on their peatlands than if they focused on forests. So it also kind of plays always into, not only can we just think about the climate and the ecological crisis, but it fits into so many different things almost at every level. And so I think that's something as well, is just expanding what we think of as being a good action or a good caretaking thing that we can currently do in our generation.
All right. The next question is from Renska, and she's wondering, what precise actions are we taking as RE-PEAT, and are you aiming to involve more people?
Carolina, did you want to answer this one?
So our main focus as RE-PEAT is we have like actually 3 focus. One is to spread awareness, because we think that, as we already mentioned at the beginning, like it's a very unknown topic for a lot of people, even people that are quite involved in environmental science, or maybe they know about it, but they're not like so aware of the impact that peatlands can have, both positive and negative if they're drained. So what we've been doing is organizing different events. Well, we started off with like real life events, back 1 year ago, and now since like we have been locked down or quarantine, we have been like moving more towards like online events, which I think right now can be a perfect solutions to like still like engage people with this conversation. We've organized in May, it's a 24-hour online PEAT Fest, during which we invited several speakers from different parts of the world and Europe, and we like had 24 hours nonstop of just different presentations and discussions about peatlands, and that was like I think very successful, and it really helped to kind of create the sense of like more people can like get to know about the topic, and also a way of networking between different like people involved in the topic, because we were doing it through a platform that we're still having and we're still using. Then we we created a peat anthology, which is a collection of stories and poems and personal like letters and art pieces that we kind of put all together in a sort of like book that we handed over to members of the European Parliament while you were discussing. I mean, there's still kind of are in the process, but we sent it with the aim of like influencing their decision on the common agriculture policy, which is like going to affect, you know, the whole sector of agriculture for 7 years, which it's quite important, you know, because as it is nowadays, the like governments are giving subsidies for farmers to drain peatlands. So this is like something that is like very important in this paradigm shift, to really like shift this and be like, okay, though we're subsidizing to, you know, re-wet peatlands and protect peatlands instead of, you know, kind of making it even harder to start these practices. And we also have other, we have been in part of like, we have been organizing reading books and webinars. So I don't know if you want to, we're also thinking of starting a educational program. It's still all in the application process in potentially 2 different countries, either Ireland or Estonia, and Estonia for children, to include peatlands in the curriculum. This is still something that is like, we're still applying for funding, so we'll see how it goes if we can manage.
All right, nice. The next question is for Elise, or it's from Elise, and she asked if there are any estimates of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are avoided by protecting existing peatlands. And I looked this up as part of my research, and from the IUCN, they said that there's about 550 gigatons of carbon that are still stored in peatlands that have not yet been degraded. And I had to look up how big a giga was, and that's a 1 with 9 zeros behind it. So 550 with 9 zeros behind it tons of carbon. It's a lot of carbon that could be saved if we do not degrade those 75% of the world's remaining intact peatlands. And some more questions from Chris. They asked, who are the stewards of peatlands in each country in the world? What parties have the most influence regarding peatland management? So I guess that's who's protecting and managing peatlands around the world.
Yeah, I think probably it has a lot of variance, I would suppose. I know that like a lot of the campaigns that were going on in Indonesia, for example, were really focusing on involving the community and really doing it as a community scheme or program. So then in that way, I think they're very well acting as stewards. And then I think it takes a lot of different forms in other places. So if you're kind of living in the cities, I think people who are maybe, yeah, I don't know, it depends on what level you require someone to be involved to be a steward, I suppose. But I mean, people who are creating art as well in the city who are not directly close to a peatland or something like this, and maybe also, in my opinion, acting as a steward. So I think there's probably a lot of people you could ask all across the world who are acting as stewards. Sorry, my light bulb just went out, so I got a bit of a shock. I'm going to pass on to someone else now.
Yeah, there's a really nice, just adding to that, I'm not really sure also how to answer this, but there's a really nice movement in Scotland as well, surrounding the Flow Country. It's the biggest blanket bog in Europe. And there's been lots of civil movement around protecting and restoring the bogs in Scotland. So that's also really nice, thing to look at.
And actually, also on that, just as we were talking about youth voices, More to the Future began a youth involvement scheme fairly recently as well, where they are teaching youth about peatlands and how to then teach more people about that. So I think in that way, it's like a really also a very effective way of disseminating knowledge and also acting as a really empowerment activity for youth as well. So that's also a really nice idea.
All right, and the next question that I can see in the chat for us is from Clara, and she would like an example of how peatlands are restored. So I can answer part of this quickly. The most common way that peat is restored is by re-wetting it. So you literally can just add water back into the peatland and restore it. I think probably either Beth, Frankie, or Carolina would know more specifics about that, but generally the best way to restore a peatland is through the process of re-wetting, which is also a nature-based solution.
Yeah, and I think it's actually, I think there was a lot of research going on in terms of best practices to do it, because it is also quite complicated, I suppose, because you kind of eroded the soil down to a point where maybe it doesn't absorb water as much anymore. So it's kind of a process of also building dams and replanting or transplanting sphagnum moss, for example, which is one of the formational plants that peatlands need to form. And there are a lot of materials on there and groups that are kind of sharing knowledge about best practices in that. So kind of things like the Yorkshire Peat Protection group, or like Frankie mentioned, the Flow Country, these kind of ones that are experimenting with different ways. And there are, I don't think any of them are here today. There are a couple of members within RE-PEAT who know a bit more of this side of it and work in the field with peatlands. And if any of them want to say anything, you're welcome. Kate just shared a link as well, which is probably quite interesting, I think.
There's also, I just wanted to add something that's connected but not necessarily the same answer to the question, which is this idea of polluting culture. So this is something that we haven't really mentioned so far, but polluting culture is basically agriculture on wet peatlands. So you can grow various crops on wet peatlands, for example, cranberries or cattail or a few other plants. And this is kind of like, there's lots of research being done at the moment by the Greifswald-Meyer Center, which is an institution in Germany. And they're basically looking at different levels of degradation, and at certain levels of degradation, so say the peatland's not very degraded, then you are quite like it's maybe smart to just re-wet it and just kind of preserve it. But then maybe sometimes the peatland's so degraded that it's not really going to kind of come back to its former like functioning self. And so then maybe to stop the CO2 emissions, you just want to have polluting culture crops growing on there, and you can use the land. And it's also another way of providing like an income for farmers that maybe do farm on peatlands, on drained peatlands, and then they can still get an income from polluting culture crops. So this is a whole nother area of research and a big question about restoring as well.
All right, and then maybe the last question we have time for is from Isabel, and she asks if there is a label or something with which you can recognize peat-free soil. So at least in the Netherlands, in my experience, peat, like soils will have an ingredient list kind of on the back where they will say if they have turf or peat in them. and a lot of the peat-free soils that are sold here in the Netherlands do have a kind of a label that says peat-free. So the most common peat-free potting soil that I found in the Netherlands is coconut peat, which is made from coconut fibers rather than peatlands. I don't think there's a standard label that is used like across the EU or in a specific country, because I don't think there's really much regulation of potting soils. But generally speaking, you can find a list of like ingredients in the soil on the back of the bag.
Yeah. Although an interesting idea, I think, to try and get the peat-free soil label. That might be an idea for a future activity or campaign for us, because I think it would be useful. And also maybe companies love having a label on them, so maybe they'll jump on board the peat-free ship. But yeah, maybe in other countries they do have it, but in the Netherlands, at least also where I am with Lenny, it's just so prevalent that they have peat that I think it's just not really a thing. Maybe in the UK or Germany where they've had a bit more peat-free soils.
All right, shall we wrap it up then?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
We're still getting comments.
Yeah, thank you for all the lovely comments, by the way. I've read all of them and they're very kind.
I believe the chat is going to be saved, right? Because there were a couple of great links that were shared in podcasts and stuff. So that would be really nice to save those. And yeah, if any of you want to get in touch, you can send us an email or follow us on Twitter or anything like that. And I'll send out the recording at some point as well. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Have a
Thank
good
you so
evening.
much.
Bye.